Previously on Project Honda Civic Si.
Wow, like everything on this car, it seems like I'm having a lot of trouble getting these new shocks installed. The problems I'm having right now go back to the energy suspension bushings I installed in this car. Remember how I had a tremendous time trying to get the suspension all go back together? Same issue. Now, there is not enough droop in the suspension to line the knuckle up with the strut because these stupid bushings are binding up like crazy, so I'm gonna have to loosen the control arm to get enough droop in the front suspension to get this to line up. I already unhooked the sway bar thinking that might be the problem, but no. Again, it's these stupid energy suspension bushings, which I never should have installed. I should have bought the Moog problem solver, the cheap ones, the cheap sealed spherical bearing bushings. I might do that in the future and just get rid of these and throw them away because they are garbage. But yeah, so I need to loosen the control arm to hopefully get this to go all back together. As you can see, it's fucking nighttime. Finally got the strut back in the car. I've only been able to do the passenger side. Today has been a complete disaster as far as doing anything to this car. The biggest problem is these energy suspension control arm bushings, surprisingly. These control arm bushings are so poorly designed, the car has no droop, which basically means if you pull the wheel off the car and jack it up, the suspension is stuck here. It is completely stuck. I can stand on this hub and it won't move at all with everything else removed because the suspension is so bound up from these fucking bushings. So the problem is you need to pull the knuckle down to get it into the strut, but because this car has no droop thanks to these stupid bushings, I ended up taking everything apart and accidentally had the jack slip and the ball joint went up and punctured my axle boot. So now my passenger side axle needs to be replaced. So I guess I need to go to the junkyard and try and find a passenger axle to swap in here, because you can't drive with a busted axle boot because you'll get the axle contaminated, then you'll break an axle and then you'll be in really big trouble. So this has been a massive fucking expensive waste of my time to only get one fucking strut in thanks to these goddamn energy suspension bushings. They are the worst thing I've ever done to any car ever. I completely regret putting them in. The stock ones were broken, they weren't that bad, I should have left them in. Anything would have been better than these things. Fuck.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Project Honda Civic Si. In today's episode, I'm going to be explaining why I've removed the energy suspension bushings from my car. Now, about 2 months ago, I filmed a video diving into these energy suspension master bushing kits. Basically, these are kits that Energy Suspension sells that presumably replace all the major serviceable bushings on your car. The kit costs, from memory, about $180, give or take. And you'd think on paper, well, that seems to be a great value because it's you can kind of knock out all your major serviceable bushings on your car all in one go, then you're all set for another 100,000 miles or whatever it may end up being. But if you watch that video, which ended up being quite long, you found out the same thing I found out, which is that the kit ended up being more problematic than I assumed. For example, the rear suspension bushings on my car, even with 110,000 miles, being a 9-year-old car that's had some track time and autocross time, I didn't actually end up needing any of those bushings, so that was kind of a waste. Fortunately, I was able to sell that whole rear suspension kit for a marginal cost and get some of that money back, but that was obviously a wasted expense in the end. Though the more problematic issue at hand ended up being the front control arm bushings, which were actually the main reason why I bought the kit. I actually ended up running into a terrible issue with the energy suspension bushings, and I touched on it in the comments in that video, but I really wanted to kind of make a full video kind of explaining it more in depth because it's kind of a hard concept to understand if you don't understand suspension theory. But basically, I have a diagram here that I've drawn. Look at that. I will put the images on the screen so you can kind of see more in depth what I did here. But basically, I drew a diagram of the front suspension from two different views, from a front-facing view and from the side-facing view, as if you're looking straight through the wheel at the front suspension. But basically, the big problem with the energy suspension bushings, which are made of polyurethane, is that while polyurethane is great in certain applications, it's terrible in others, and this is one of the applications where polyurethane is a terrible idea in the front control arms. And for my case, it became an issue of binding and droop. Now, what I mean by that is is it refers to the movement of suspension. So when your wheel hits a bump, right, the wheel goes up and down just like the suspension goes up and down. It's kind of a fixed thing, right? You hit the bump, the suspension moves just like the wheel and tire moves. Now the problem is, while stock bushings have a great amount of droop, which is the motion where the suspension goes down, the energy suspension bushings did not. They had a binding effect, which is basically where the bushings were so stiff in the wrong way they didn't allow the suspension to articulate. So basically, the suspension, where if you unbolt everything, the control arms will actually kind of fall to the ground normally. With the energy suspension bushings, they will get bound up and kind of get stuck in one position. They'd kind of be like flat like that versus drooping to the floor. And you may be wondering, well, what's wrong with that? Stiff suspension. But the problem is that basically means the car had no front suspension travel effectively because the suspension was so bound up by those bushings. Now, suspension bind is problematic in multiple ways. It basically means the suspension has a very non-linear reaction and action to bumps, because basically, if you hit a bump, normal suspension will kind of go up and down, but when it binds up, it gets stuck, and then eventually the weight of the car and the movement of the wheel and tire will overcome that binding and kind of jerk it through and kind of creates that sort of non-linearity. Not good for handling, or predictableness, or sort of really anything. Now, the bigger problem for me at the time actually ended up being a more pragmatic one, which is the suspension binding issue was so bad that I couldn't actually reinstall the front suspension altogether, because basically the control arm was completely stuck in one position, and that means I couldn't get the ball joint into the control arm, or vice versa. I really couldn't put the whole front suspension together without a lot of brute force, because the suspension was basically just bound up. It was totally stuck. Normally the front suspension should have a nice smooth motion. You should kind of put it all together by hand and go from there. That ended up not being the case for me, and in my case, I ended up trying to use brute force to put it all back together, and I ended up pushing my ball joint straight through my axle and tearing an axle boot. That was an expensive mistake, and I clearly learned something I should have known better, is that suspension binding is a bad thing, especially when you try and force the car to go back together. So I ended up having to buy a replacement used axle, which I put back in the car, which is actually pretty straightforward, thankfully. It also meant, well, clearly these bushings have to go. And before I dive into that, I wanted to give a brief primer about the front compliance bushing. So on the front control arms of these Civics, there's two bushings. There's the rear position bushing, which is just a control arm bushing, and the front position bushing, which is called the compliance bushing. Now, the rear position bushing is very simple, very conventional. It mounts into the front subframe. It is on a horizontal axis. Basically, the bolt goes through the bushing on a horizontal axis like that. And so basically all the bushing has to do is rotate around that bolt. Very simple. Now, that compliance bushing, that front position bushing, the main one that wears out on Hondas, is a bit more complicated. So it has a vertical axis mounting point. So basically the mounting bolt goes up into the front subframe like that. And again, you think, oh, single axis, no big deal. But because of the way it's mounted and the way the control arm articulates, that's actually what we call a multi-axis bushing. So basically the control arm is canted, and so when you mount the control arm bushing on a vertical axis, that bushing needs to kind of turn on multiple axes. It kind of goes like this. Rather than kind of going one direction, it goes both. It turns on both axes, which basically means if you put polyurethane there, it's gonna bind all the time and create that sort of non-linearity and that bad handling sensation. So normally you'd want a bushing there that's firm but has good articulation. So you'd want like a stiff rubber, or ideally like a spherical bearing that can kind of rotate and turn and kind of do everything you want to do nice and smoothly while getting rid of slop. Okay, so I have touched on multi-axis bushings. If you have watched my E46 videos, my drift car, you notice I've talked about this quite a lot because it's actually kind of a common problem with aftermarket parts where they're not quite thought out very well and you end up having problems when you use them. But anyway, so the bushings had to go. Now, fortunately, someone watching this video actually had a great suggestion for me as far as a replacement bushing, and that comes from the company Moog. Now, you may know them for being an OEM replacement parts type company, but they actually have a great option that fits most Hondas for that front compliance bushing specifically. And if you dig into it, while it looks like an OE bushing replacement on the outside, it actually has a very thick metal casing on the outside. When you peel back the boot, it's actually a sealed spherical bearing in there. So it's actually kind of a budget racing option, and that's the way I went. So let's cut to the footage of me installing these sealed spherical bearing Moog bushings that should hopefully fix our binding issues and make the car handle better and actually be able to be assembled and disassembled on a somewhat easily and regular basis. Okay, Civic is on jack stands again. I guess this is technically week 2 of trying to install new shocks in this car. So I found a used axle assembly for 60 bucks. The guy threw in the intermediate shaft, which I'll just hang on to, but here's the axle. It seems like it's in okay shape, and this inside boot being kind of worn out. I might take a look at that. But yeah, now I have the joy of replacing an axle on this car, all because I tried to install some shocks, and the energy suspension bushings bit me in the ass. All right, taking a quick break from this reinstallation process of the replacement bushings to kind of give you a little fill-in. So I went with the Moog sealed spherical bearings K200799. I think it's part number. It fits like most front-wheel drive Hondas. Anyway, the installation is pretty simple. It's a lot like the poly bushing install I covered in a previous episode. Basically, you're going to go to your local auto parts store and rent a ball joint press kit where they have a bunch of these little cylindrical cutouts. And then you're going to use this biggest one. In the kit, you'll notice right away it's the largest one in diameter. It's the perfect size where this flange, the face of it, perfectly fits the contour and shape of the OEM control arm. Like a little like pocket it perfectly sits on. Then for the Moogle bushing, you're just going to use this step down smaller size. Same thing. The Moogle bushing has a big metal outer ring casing that this kind of just sits perfectly on. And then you put a weight or something on top of this and just press it straight down. Obviously, the Moog metal casing means it's metal on metal. Pressing in the control arm means there's a lot of force, but it'll go in to make sure you do it nice and smooth and evenly. Also wanted to go over here and go to the installation process. Now, for those of you who watched the previous episode where I installed the energy suspension bushings, you'll recall I had a lot of trouble getting the control arm back into the chassis with those new bushings. And that's because the fit of the compliance bushing, this main front bushing here, was just not that great, in addition to the crazy binding effect it had to the front suspension. With this Moog bushing, I literally installed this in 30 seconds, and it kind of just slid right in. I retained the energy suspension rear position bushing because that's like less of an issue. I'm going to have to modify it for binding in the future, but for now, I just want to show you that with just the replacement of this Moog compliance bushing, sorry about the suspension in the way, but yeah, I can finally move the control arm, which kind of allows me to put this whole thing together and take it apart much more nicely. So there it is. Got the Moog bushings installed on the car, as you saw from the brief video clip. Unlike the energy bushings, they installed no problems quite easily. Fit and finish is perfect. After driving the car around, the ride quality is nice. They make no noise. Great product overall. Definitely recommend the Moog compliance bushings, part number K200799. They're 20 bucks each on Amazon. You need 2, obviously, 1 for each side of the car. Check them out. And that is it for this episode of Project Civic SI. Next time, I will be looking into performance alignment options now that we've got the new shocks and control arm bushings all sorted out. So, see you next time. Bye.